He never needed a diagnosis to understand pain. He didn't use a wheelchair, didn't need a cane, but grief had paralyzed him just the same. Every morning he wrote a letter to a child no longer living, but never truly gone. He didn't share them, didn't post them, didn't even tell his wife, because these letters weren't meant for the world. They were how he held on, and eventually how he learned to let go. This is the story of a father, a box of unsent letters, and the invisible kind of healing that changes more lives than we'll ever know. Most people knew him simply as Mr. Reyes, the soft-spoken school librarian with salt and pepper hair, kind eyes, and a tie that never quite matched. The man who always had time for one more question, one more lost child, one more lonely soul looking for a place to belong. He quoted Hemingway without sounding pretentious. He remembered birthdays, and he shelved every book by hand, even when the district offered him a cart and an assistant. But at home, he wasn't Mr. Reyes, he was just Mateo, a father, a husband, and a man trying to survive the kind of silence that doesn't echo but swallows. His son Daniel had been born with a heart condition so rare the doctors had to look it up in journals older than themselves. And for 17 years, Mateo and his wife fought for every breath their son could take. Every hospital stay, every medication change, every hopeful look exchanged in pediatric waiting rooms where time stood still. Daniel was gentle. He loved graphic novels, magic tricks, and rainy afternoons spent building Lego castles with his dad. He had a laugh that came out in bursts, quick, bright, and full of life. And then just like that, he was gone, not with a bang, not with a scream, but with the kind of stillness that changes the shape of a room forever. At the funeral, Mateo stood tall. He greeted guests. He thanked them. He held his wife's trembling hand and whispered that they'd be okay. But later that night, when the house emptied and the casseroles were wrapped in foil, he went into Daniel's room, sat on the edge of the bed, and just stared at the wall. He didn't cry. He didn't break. He just went quiet, as if the world had turned its volume all the way down, and only his heartbeat remained, heavy and hollow. He went back to work the next week. Everyone called him strong, but no one saw the cracks behind his smile. No one noticed how the light in his eyes dimmed every time a teenage boy walked past in a red hoodie, Daniel's favorite color. And no one knew that grief had wrapped itself around Mateo's chest like a vine, tight, unrelenting, invisible. What finally pulled him out of that silence? That answer wouldn't come from a doctor, or a friend, or even from his wife. It would come from a pen. It was quiet when it happened. No epiphany, no music, just the sound of a coffee mug being set down too hard, and the ticking of a clock that had felt too loud ever since Daniel passed. It was Daniel's birthday, 18, the age he was supposed to register to vote, get his license, go to college, fall in love. Instead, the kitchen smelled like burnt toast, and the only card on the counter was blank. Mateo sat alone at the table, a stack of unopened mail beside him, Daniel's chair untouched. For 17 years, he had made a tradition of writing his son a birthday note, tucked inside a card or scrawled on a napkin with a doodle of a heart. Even when Daniel was in the hospital, even when he was too sick to read it, Mateo still wrote. That morning, he reached for a pen out of muscle memory, not with a plan, but with a need. He pulled out a lined notebook from the junk drawer, opened it, and just started writing. Dear Daniel, today I imagined you driving. You always wanted a red car, remember? I still see you when I pass one. I wonder if you'd have your music too loud. I'd tell you to turn it down. You'd pretend you didn't hear me. Love always, Dad. There was nothing profound about the letter. No wisdom, no answers, just memory and ache. He stared at the page when it finished. The ink smudged a little where his hand had trembled. It looked like a child's writing, almost, or someone learning to speak again. He didn't know what to do with it. It felt ridiculous. A grown man writing to someone who couldn't write back, but he folded it, dated it, and slid it into an old shoebox he found in Daniel's closet. Then he put it under the bed, didn't tell his wife, didn't reread it, just left it there like a time capsule he hoped no one would ever find. He thought that would be the end of it. But the next morning, the pen reached for him again, and this time, he didn't resist. What made the writing continue? And who was he really writing for? One letter became two. Two became 20, then 200. Each morning before the sun rose, before the world could interrupt, Mateo sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Daniel used to finish homework, build puzzles, spill orange juice. He opened the same notebook, used the same pen, and he wrote, Dear Daniel, the lilacs are blooming early this year. You used to bury your nose in them until your allergies flared up. I still bought the antihistamines just in case. Love, Dad. Some days the letters were short, a line, a whisper, a memory he couldn't let fade. Other days they spilled out like water from a cracked dam. 10 pages of tangled thoughts about guilt, about fear, about the moments he wished he could redo. He told Daniel about the world without him, how the school upgraded to digital checkouts, how students rushed past books they once lingered over, how his mother had stopped listening to music in the car, and how he still waited for a dream, a sign, a visit in his sleep that never came. He told Daniel about the students, too, the ones who reminded him of his son, a boy who refused to wear matching socks, a girl who whispered when she read aloud, a teenager who stayed after school to alphabetize graphic novels because he said the shelves felt too messy. Each one pulled a memory out of Mateo, and each time he wrote, but he told no one, not his wife, not his colleagues, not even the grief counselor who offered him tools for healing. This wasn't for closure, this was survival, his way of breathing through cement, of standing in the world without collapsing into it. Because grief for Mateo wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet disability, one that lived in his chest, pressed behind his ribs, invisible but constant. The world around him didn't ask if he was okay anymore. They assumed he had moved on, smiling at work, filing books, carrying on. But every time he said, I'm fine, there was a letter waiting to say otherwise. And beneath the bed, the shoebox began to fill, page by page, day by day, love by impossible love. But one day, the words stopped coming. What happens when the one thing keeping you afloat begins to fail you? It was a Tuesday in late January, the kind of morning that clung to your bones. Frost etched the windows in lace-like patterns, and the library lights flickered as the old boiler groaned to life. Mateo sat at the kitchen table like always, coffee gone cold, notebook open, pen ready. But his hand wouldn't move. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the page stayed blank. He tried, pressed the pen to paper, wrote Dear Daniel, and circled the letters like he was waiting for them to speak back. But nothing came, not a memory, not a thought, not even pain. just a numb, gnawing fog that made his fingers feel foreign. His chest tightened, not a heart attack, not grief, something worse, doubt. What if I've said everything? What if I'm forgetting him? The idea cut deeper than he expected. If the letters stopped, would Daniel fade? Would silence win? He slammed the notebook shut, shoved it into the drawer, paced the kitchen until the coffee reheated, then stood motionless for 5 minutes, staring out the window at nothing. That night he thought about burning the shoebox. He even held a match, watched it flicker near the edge of the first letter, the birthday one. But he couldn't do it, not yet. Instead, he went to work the next morning wearing the same tie as always, smiled at the front desk clerk, scanned books in silence, and that's when she came. Sophie, 12 years old, freckled face, dark blonde braid that hung down her shoulder like a question mark. Deaf since birth, sharp as sunlight. She was a regular in the library, always arrived before the bell, sat in the corner with oversized books and a thermos of peppermint tea. She didn't speak, didn't sign much either, but her eyes, they were observant in ways words couldn't match. That morning, she walked in slowly, didn't go to her usual spot. Instead, she approached the circulation desk and slid a notebook across it. Mateo looked up, puzzled. She tapped the page gently. He opened it. One sentence, block letters, written with care. You make this library feel safe. My dad doesn't talk to me much, but you do. Thank you, Mateo froze. For a moment, he forgot how to breathe. He looked up, eyes meeting hers. Sophie just nodded, soft, certain, then walked away. He didn't follow, didn't speak, just stood there, holding the notebook like it might vanish if he blinked too hard. And something cracked, not like glass, but like a door, long shut, finally beginning to open. He didn't know it yet, but Sophie had just given him a reason to write again. But this time, he wouldn't write to Daniel. And these letters wouldn't stay hidden. That night, Mateo sat down to write again, but not to Daniel. The page felt unfamiliar at first, like a new room in a house he'd lived in for years. He stared at the blank paper, waiting for guilt to creep in. It didn't. Instead, he thought of Sophie, of her quiet bravery, of the weight behind her simple words. You make this library feel safe. So he began. Dear Sophie, I know what it's like to feel unheard. Sometimes the loudest pain is the one that can't make a sound. You reminded me that silence doesn't mean invisibility. Thank you for seeing me when I forgot how to see myself. A friend. He folded it, but this time he didn't hide it in a box. He slipped it into a copy of Anne of Green Gables, Sophie's favorite, and left it on the table where she always sat. The next morning the book was gone, but when Sophie looked up from the corner, there was something new in her eyes, a softness, and a knowing smile, and just like that, the letters began again. But now they weren't just for Daniel or Sophie. They were for everyone who walked through that library with something heavy they couldn't name. He wrote to the boy with ADHD who couldn't sit still and always returned his books late, but never lost one. To the grieving mother who came in every Tuesday after visiting the cemetery down the road, always leaving with the same copy of The Little Prince. To the teacher with burnout in her eyes and a coffee stain on her shirt, who once confessed to Mateo that she didn't think she was making a difference anymore. He wrote to them all, typed them, printed them, folded each letter by hand, carefully, reverently, and tucked them into books throughout the library. He signed every note the same way. If you found this, it was meant for you, from someone who understands. At first, he wasn't sure anyone would even find them, but then the responses started. A yellow sticky note tucked into the book return bin. To the person who left the letter in To Kill a Mockingbird. I thought no one saw me. Thank you for proving me wrong. A handwritten card slipped under the library office door. You saved me today. I hope you know that. Some readers added their own messages and tucked them into new books, creating an invisible trail of empathy. A quiet network of voices, unseen, unspoken, connecting through paper and ink. It wasn't loud, it wasn't viral, but it was real. And Daniel, the boy whose heart had stopped beating, was still helping others feel alive. Because in every letter Mateo wrote, there was a thread of his son, his kindness, his curiosity, his quiet strength. And for the first time since Daniel's death, Mateo felt like a father again, not just to the memory of his son, but to anyone who needed one. But what happens when the letters are no longer anonymous and someone asks to share the box? 2 years after that first letter to Daniel, on a crisp spring evening, the school auditorium buzzed with quiet anticipation. Rows of folding chairs filled the room. Teachers, parents, and students gathered for the annual senior project showcase. Mateo sat in the back. He hadn't planned to be there, but Sophie had asked him just once, with a small signed question. Will you come? She hadn't told him what her project was about. She didn't need to. He saw it in her eyes. The lights dimmed. A student fiddled nervously with a projector. Then Sophie walked onto the stage. Taller now, hair shorter, but still Sophie, still steady. The room hushed. She didn't speak. She signed, and next to her, on a large screen, her words appeared. Typed, elegant, patient, each one landing like a soft hammer on the hearts of the audience. My name is Sophie Reynolds. I was born deaf. For a long time, I thought that made me broken, until someone showed me that silence can be sacred too. She paused, took a breath. My project is about invisible disabilities, about grief and trauma and loneliness, the kinds that don't show up in parking permits or diagnosis codes. Behind her, a slideshow began. Images of books, notes tucked between pages, typed letters folded gently, some yellowed with time, then a box, a simple wooden box, old, scratched, carefully restored, the same box that had lived under Mateo's bed until a month ago, when his wife found it while searching for an old tax folder. She hadn't asked questions. She had just carried it to him and placed a hand over his. He didn't speak, but something in him surrendered. Later that week, Sophie had seen the box. She had asked very gently if she could share it. Just once, she signed. And now, here it was. Sophie walked back to the center of the stage, hands steady, eyes shimmering, the auditorium silent. Then she pulled a single letter from the box. The first one, the birthday letter. She unfolded it slowly, lifted it toward the microphone, and as she signed the words, a student read aloud beside her, "Dear Daniel, today a girl found her voice, and somehow I found mine too. Love, Dad." There was no applause at first, just breathless stillness. Somewhere in the middle rows, a teacher began to cry. A student held their parent's hand a little tighter. And Mateo, in the back row, sat frozen. His hands trembled in his lap. But he didn't hide them, he didn't bow his head, because for the first time since Daniel's death, he wasn't alone in his grief. The letters had found their way to Sophie, to the students, to the teachers. to everyone who had ever needed words but couldn't find them, and now they were out in the open. But how did these letters change the lives of those who read them? And what did they see in the man who wrote them? Mateo never meant for anyone to know, but the letters, they spoke for themselves. And slowly, the people who found them, who felt them, began to speak too. Their words weren't dramatic, just honest, human. Proof that even anonymous kindness can leave permanent echoes. First voice, Sophie, now 17, signing at the podium. He never talked to me like I was different. He didn't feel the silence. I think he understood it. When I found that first letter in my favorite book, it felt like someone finally saw the whole of me, not just what I couldn't say. Second voice, Mr. Klein, a middle-aged science teacher in his third decade of teaching. I was close to quitting, burnout, paperwork, feeling invisible. Then I opened a book during lunch, The Catcher in the Rye, and found a note that said, "Even the tired ones are still showing up. That counts too." It was the first time I'd felt encouraged in years. Third voice, Angela, a widowed mother who quietly visits the library every Tuesday. I found a letter tucked in Charlotte's Web. It talked about losing someone and loving them anyway. I still don't know who wrote it, but it helped me grieve my daughter without feeling ashamed of how long it's taken me. These weren't grand gestures, they were folded slips of paper, but for the people who read them, they were lifelines. We live in a world that celebrates what can be measured: degrees, diagnoses, outcomes, results. We notice the cast on a broken arm, the ramp built for a wheelchair, the cane tapping out a path through a crowded street. But what about the weight people carry inside, the kind you can't see, but can feel if you listen closely enough? Grief is one of those weights. So is anxiety, so is trauma, so is the hollow space left behind when someone you love disappears from the dinner table, but never from your life. These are invisible disabilities. They don't come with parking passes. They don't get asked about on medical forms. And yet, they shape how people move through the world, or whether they can move at all. Mateo never saw himself as disabled, but grief had paralyzed parts of him no one ever asked about. Not until Sophie, not until a notebook across a desk, not until one brave girl's thank you cracked something wide open. And that's the truth about invisible struggles. They don't always scream. Sometimes they write. They write their way into healing, into connection, into legacy. And when we give those stories space, when we listen without needing to fix, when we witness without asking someone to move on, we make the invisible visible. Because every time a letter is written, a silence gets broken. Every time a story is shared, a stigma is shattered. And every time someone like Mateo dares to speak, even in a whisper, someone else learns that they're not alone. So what will you do with the letter inside you? We talk so much about healing, as if it's loud, as if it's linear, as if it always ends with a smile. But sometimes healing looks like this: a man at a kitchen table, a shoebox under a bed, a library full of letters folded in secret and sealed with love. Mateo never published those letters. He never wrote a book. He never stood on a stage. He just kept showing up, pen in hand, heart wide open, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. Because grief doesn't always ask for attention. It doesn't wear a cast or show up in test results. But that doesn't make it any less real. And sometimes the quietest stories, the ones we tuck away, hide in drawers, whisper in journals, are the ones that end up saving someone else. If you've ever lost someone, maybe you've written to them in your mind. Maybe you've whispered their name into a pillow. Maybe your grief has no words at all. Just wait. That's not weakness, that's love, still alive. So if there's a letter inside you, write it, even if no one ever sees it, even if it never leaves your hands, because you never know whose silence it might soften. And if this story moved you, if you felt seen or heard or held in any small way, we invite you to stay. Subscribe to Able in every way. Share this video with someone who carries something invisible, and leave us a comment. Whether it's a name, a memory, or a letter you've never had the chance to send, you're not alone. Not in your silence, not in your story. And here, you never have to be.